So hello everyone. Um, for those of you on the call, just would like to let you know that meeting is being recorded. This is a live call, so there may be some technical issues. Hopefully we can work through them. So I'm Nana. I'm the engineering manager for DSC, and we do have a few important people here on this call. We have Katie, Maria, Charles, Travis, and others from the team. They have been running the DSC Resource Kit over the last few months. We have other important, community contributors. Especially, I would like to call out Michael Gris is in here. He's part of the ECG group in the CAT team, but he's been one of the prominent contributors to the resource kit. We have Brian Funhill. He's the main contributor and maintains the SharePoint DSC. We have Keith, who's a PM from our team. He's been driving the resource kit from the PM side as well as Nima. And fellow contributors, some of whom I can recognize, like Tyson, Alexander, and others. Sorry if I missed your name. So this is the first in a series of calls that we would have in terms of running the DSC Resource Kit community call. It's going to be run by Katie. So Katie, I'll let you take over from here.
Thanks, Dana. My name is Katie. I am the current owner of the DSC Resource Kit, and I am also on the PowerShell DSC team. So I hope all of you guys have noticed by now, but we did a DSC Resource Kit release yesterday. It's our June release, and we had about 106 merge pull requests. So thank you to everybody who contributed. And I want to open up the floor for any of you guys to talk about our release cadence, how often we release. Right now we tend to put out releases when we see there's been a lot of contribution, like a lot of pull requests merged or a lot of issues have been closed. We have a lot of new resources. Recently that's been about 6 weeks apart. But I was wondering what you guys thought about that release cadence. Anybody have any thoughts? You can, if you're on the phone, you guys can unmute yourself by pressing *6. And anybody on Skype for Business, there's a mute icon that you can click to unmute yourself. Are you guys satisfied with how often these releases go out?
So I'm Tyson. I mostly contribute to a number of your resources like web administration, networking, a couple of other things.
Hi, Tyson.
Howdy. I just wanted to say, I think 6 weeks is okay, but what I've really been looking for, which you guys have kind of started doing just in the last week or so, is kind of some broadcast of saying, hey, this is the next time we're going to do a release. I think kind of calling the ball early so we can have some heads up on that. I know as I manage a lot of my stuff, I've missed a couple of releases because I've got something, because I didn't know it was coming and I had a big merge that I wanted to get into the next one.
Yeah.
That just missed it, because we didn't know it was coming, and then, Charles comes by and just, slams it all over to master. So, which is fine. So I think as long as, this is a good start to that, and as long as we kind of start communicating that out, I think 6 weeks is a good place to start. And as long as we're just kind of saying, hey, we're going to do this, and everyone get your stuff in, and, and so we kind of know when it's coming, and, then I think that's perfect.
Yeah. How early before the release do you think you need to be warned?
I think in an ideal world, we'd literally set it right now and say we're going to do it in 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Because, and I say that not half jokingly, only just because, if we start broadcasting it out the next time, this is the next time it's coming, we know that we have people that are not going to be on this call or people who we're just interacting with, can start picking up on oh, I need to have this fully committed and up and mergeable by the time we get to the next, if I want it in the next release. Because I know some of the guys that Maria have been working with was doing a huge style push that we barely got done yesterday, the day before, or 2 days ago.
Yeah.
Barely under the wire. Had he known that this was coming, I think we could have maybe gotten it done sooner and fixed up anything else that may have been niggling out. ahead of the next release.
Okay. Yeah, I'm definitely planning to put out as soon as we decide when we're doing the next release, I'll put it out on my Twitter channel, and I'll post it on our main DSC Resource Kit repo, which is the DSC Resources repository on GitHub. There's a new community agenda file to try to give you guys more of a warning.
So does it help if you put it out, like, say, a week in advance, or do you want it longer time?
A week's a good place to start, but as I said, I'd really like to see it, like, if we're going to call it, say, every 6 weeks, let's just do every 6 weeks. Like,
okay.
So to help me understand that, and maybe some other people kind of have this question, like, I get you guys kind of just decide, I think we have enough stuff or whatever to do something.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a reason we're kind of doing it that way versus just saying a hard, like, every 6 weeks we're going to do a release regardless of what we've kind of been doing? Because to me, it's assumed we've been merging stuff and have been fixing things. Like, why are we waiting to have quote unquote enough versus just saying that's when this is going to happen?
Yeah, I would say within the past 6 months or so, the contributors have really stepped up, and we've started getting a lot of changes so that we can release every 6 weeks. I think prior to that, the problem was that in 6 weeks there just weren't enough changes that we could actually justify an entire release of the DSC Resource Kit. So now I would say I'm much more open to setting a hard date now that we have people actually making significant changes within that 6 week time frame.
And not to try to railroad anyone, if anyone else wants to talk, please feel free to talk over me. Have we thought about doing releases on a per resource basis, just to say, like, when X web administration, for example, or web administration, just start calling it, is ready to go, or SharePoint's ready to go, like, we can just merge to master, or is there kind of, I guess, what's the logic of kind of releasing it all at once? Is that just kind of a big celebration, or is there kind of like,
yeah, well, I don't want to put out a separate blog for every resource. So having them all go out together is a good way to tell you guys that they're actually released. Now with Twitter and things, we could probably post on Twitter saying, like, oh, we just released only X web admin or only XPS DSC.
So there's also another distinction I would like to add. The integration can happen, how so often we want, but the release also involves, taking that code, revving up the version correctly, running all the checks, and publishing it all to the gallery, which is what is the one that happens once every 6 weeks. So yeah, the merge to the master and the submissions can happen throughout, but we're talking about the publish process, which someone has to run from our end, and it makes sense for us to bundle them together.
Oh, no, I'm not against us bundling it up. I just see it as, like, if we have a high priority fix, for example, that goes into web administration, that's like, we've broken some fundamental functionality. Like, I now have to, like, now everyone's broken for 6 weeks until we do a push,
We can release on an individual resource module basis.
Okay, cool.
So if you have a hotfix or something, just tag me, QuirkyCat, on GitHub and say, like, we need this in now. And we'll evaluate it and see if we can release it right then.
Yeah, it's fair to me.
Yeah. Anybody else? Anything about the release cadence? Anything about maybe our release blogs that go out? Is Twitter the best way to tell you guys that the resource kit has been released? Or the blog? I'm not sure. Those are the avenues that I have. I don't know if anybody is on Facebook or another social media that maybe we're missing.
So this is Naomi. I'm with Target, and
Hi, Naomi.
I primarily consume the SharePoint DSC modules, but I also consume Compute and Web Administration and a few others, SQL Server.
Mm-hmm.
I actually just watch my repos.
Okay.
Twitter's great, but I also follow a bunch of other people, so sometimes I can get lost. I don't watch the blog. I'm really looking at GitHub to be my source of truth.
Okay.
And I'll echo what Tyson was saying, like having something actually published, like my individual modules released, more frequently is, I know the SharePoint module, for example, is one that is updated really frequently, and I am like waiting with bated breath to get the next functionality in. So, and I'm consuming from the gallery. So if I'm waiting 6 weeks, like we're delaying my production cycle. So.
Okay.
No, just had a question, Naomi. Is there a reason you're kind of going off of the release from the gallery versus just like pulling it from GitHub or whatever and kind of using that as your deployment mechanism?
So I'm using Chef to orchestrate all of this. I'm not using pure DSC because I have to manage 19 SharePoint farms. And so I am installing all of this via NuGet, and so I go out and through the gallery behind my proxy, and we get the current resources pulled into our internal artifact repo, and then reference from there. So I don't want to maintain a zip file. I can. I have done it when I've needed something really bad, but it's definitely not my preferred practice.
Oh, great, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, we do release SharePoint right now on a slightly different release cadence because there's so much contribution to that module.
Right, and it's great.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian, who I think is on this call.
Yeah, I'm just listening quietly in the background here. It's 6 a.m. and I'm still waking up, but it's good to have that feedback as well.
Yeah. And speaking of SharePoint, I don't know if you guys, probably some of you guys have noticed, for XPS desired state configuration and XWebAdmin, we've been starting to develop a more concrete plan for making them high-quality resource modules. And we recently released SharePoint DSC instead of the experimental X SharePoint, which would signify that that is now a high-quality resource module, since that has now been released as version 1.0 and 1.1 as of yesterday. So our plans in XPS DSC and XWebAdmin involve adding a lot of unit tests. They involve updating style, making sure that the code is up to production quality. And some of our plans don't mesh with SharePoint DSC all the way, things like making sure the format is uniform. And so looking at those three plans, which one would be a high-quality resource module?
So I will just call out a couple of things there based on the plans that you guys have got for web admin and the PSDSC configuration one. Most of the stuff that are in the plans for what you guys have got there, we've actually got in our backlog committed to the next couple of release milestones anyway. So like for 1.1, we cleared up a few of the script analyzer warnings and that sort of stuff, and we've got the complete refactor to get to lining up with the code formatting and that sort of stuff down for I think it's like 1.3 and that sort of stuff. So I think what we've got in that space is that we don't necessarily have the documented plan like a separate markdown document like is in those other two repos, but I think we've got the path forward for those next couple of releases that we've got to tick similar boxes at least anyway, if that's at all helpful to know.
Mm-hmm. What do you guys think marks a resource module as production ready?
Personally, for me, it's like I kind of really feel like a couple of our resources are actually there. Like, I know we're not calling out X networking, but Daniel and I have worked really hard on getting it all the points kind of uniform there, kind of ready to go. I think everything we've kind of covered actually on the that we've laid out for our plans of getting it to pass the script analyzer and be consistently working is pretty big.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, because I look at it as like I really feel like web administration is very close, even though we're missing a lot of functionality that you can get in IIS. Like our web config story is kind of terrible. Like you can only change like one small chunk of it, for example. But I really feel like the one that's there works pretty well. And I'm currently using web administration in production.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, like from my perspective, and have been since like, I don't know, 1.4 or something, like when whenever DSC came out was like one of the first resources I started using, which is part of why I started contributing to it in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking for like checkboxes, I think kind of like the stuff that Maria's already laid out, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing her name wrong, like is pretty good. Barred, I should say, most of our resources should meet.
Do you think things like style are important? Code style?
I'm totally the wrong person to ask that because my answer is, dear God, yes, because I hate reading bad style. But I think, honestly, if I'm really going to get down to brass tacks, no. It really shouldn't matter, but I think it does present a very good resource for anyone who wants to come in and look at it.
Mm-hmm.
For knowing that the code's clean and that's very consistent and very easy to read. I find it it's one of the things I love about PowerShell is that you can make it look very pretty and very consistent.
Yeah. Do you guys think it's super important that everything has unit tests? I think some things can't have unit tests. That's a big problem that we're running into. A lot of things have to have only integration tests because they have to run in a certain environment, which is, I know, something that we ran into in Exchange, where those tests just have to run on an Exchange server because there's certain functions that we just can't mock.
Yeah, there are some ways around some of that, though. We hit similar issues with SharePoint DSC as well. I ended up having a rather entertaining conversation with one of the guys who wrote Pester, and we came up with a way to essentially stub out and mock every single commandlet that was in SharePoint, it's like 20,000 lines of just mock PowerShell code to be able to simulate having SharePoint available on the server. There's a couple of blog posts that I wrote on what came out of that conversation, but we've essentially used that to be able to mock against both SharePoint 2013 and 2016 for the unit tests to be able to run. So maybe we need to have a look at some stuff like that for where we've got complicated things like Exchange, like SharePoint and that sort of stuff as a way to be able to follow that up. And yeah, Travis, I'm literally just opening my blog now to grab those links. So
I'm going to side with Brian here. I think not being able to having to integrate do just integration tests and not being able to unit test something says we might need to look at mocking stuff better. I have talked to some testers about this because I struggle with doing unit testing and kind of understanding the concepts of it, because obviously there's a point where if you're mocking to the point where you're describing functionality that may change, and so then your unit tests will pass even though the integration tests won't. But like to get around that in like networking, we've had to we've had to set up integration, like we've had to set up pull in other things to set up fake networking interfaces to unit test against or run integration tests with it. I think if we make the challenge to ourselves to say we need to unit test and integration, and integrate tests everything, then I think we will pull out technology that will ultimately be useful as we continue to grow, and practices that will continue to go as we face those challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I've just dropped the link to that blog post in there, so that talks about how we basically pulled out and generated empty stub functions for everything in the PowerShell snap-in that SharePoint ships, but we could target a module or anything that you needed to target to generate those stubs there, which was great for us because it meant that we not only had the empty functions there to be able to mock against, but it was also validating things for us that we were like using parameter sets correctly, like calling them with the right combinations of parameters and that sort of stuff, which where we had differences between SharePoint 2013 and 2016 meant that we could find that out at the time of unit testing instead of having to wait for like an integration test to figure it out.
All right, I'm totally borrowing this. But yeah, no, as I said, I'm not the right person to talk about style because I'm looking at this and I want to fix all your tabs or your spacing. It's just like... look at that blog post, and a lot of the spacing got ruined when we migrated across to WordPress, and I just haven't gone through and fixed all the old posts. But
but yeah, no, just on styling, I do know that there's a lot of stuff that we in the SharePoint one, because we started out very, very early, we sort of had our own style guides and neglected to keep up to date with what the main DSC resources were doing. So we've sort of got our own set of rules, which we're merging back in towards the main ones on. So we're different, but there's order to the chaos that's there at the moment, I think, is the point that I'm throwing out. But
And I think to that point, I think as long as it's consistent more than anything.
Yeah.
For me, it's not.
Yeah, exactly.
For me, it's not just we're matching what the master resources are, which we should be shooting for, but it's just it's consistent in general. Like,
Well, I want to put the question a little differently, which is, so the whole idea of making these high quality resources is so that, people have been complaining these are marked experimental, we can't apply them on production. And so now, we want to encourage people to deploy these on production. So, we are doing this high quality resource work. How important is it for like someone to put this in production? Like how important is unit tests available so I can download, validate before I can deploy? Is that like a criteria, or is it more for like giving confidence?
This is Chris from Ticketmaster, and I'd say yes to unit testing as a criteria. It's basically a checkbox for the quality of the module and the resource. Otherwise, it's just we have to reverse engineer it to even trust it. So.
Mm-hmm.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
This is Keith. I am the PM for the PowerShell gallery. When you say it's a check mark, does that mean that you want us to be able to identify that it has them, that they run, that they've been reviewed and they look like they're reasonable, that, it's like when you say there's a check mark there, what is your expectation of that meaning?
Well, for us, the unit tests will get run as part of our build process. So from our perspective, I don't necessarily need to have somebody else validate it. It's just that when we build this, it's going to run unit tests. They're going to come up clean, and we know that we have a good build of everything that we're dependent on.
Do you care about like code
might
coverage?
Change. Yeah. Well, I mean, ideally, yes. It would be nice if we didn't have to unit test everything that we're importing.
Okay. Is there like a threshold for code coverage? Like you would say if only 50% of the code is covered, we can't trust that.
It would depend on the I guess the complexity of the resource.
Okay.
I mean, if it's like writing a file and it's only got 50% code coverage, that's one thing. But a larger complex thing that's messing around with enterprise components would probably be 90% or higher, depending on Pester's code coverage calculations are a little not ideal, so I wouldn't put too much behind them.
Okay.
so I know I'm kind of talking a lot in this meeting, but I have a lot to say. So I know I'm planning on using integration and unit tests as I'm starting building out images and kind of creating files, and when I'm start putting and building up a build process around this stuff. That if the unit tests and the integration tests aren't passing, I'm not planning on shipping changes. So, I'm planning on adding more integration tests for my own custom things. But the expectation is that all the integration tests that we're writing will also be run with my stuff. And I know in the networking changes, it's actually been very useful because commandlets won't exist if you're running on various different versions of the operating system. So for a while I was running on 2008 R2, but we targeted 2012, and it was a fantastic litmus test to say, oh hey, dummy, this is not going to work because you're running it on the wrong operating system. So I think putting a lot of time into that will ultimately show value out of the people consuming it if they're utilizing those tests to validate their own systems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would probably go a long way towards helping the the gallery's reputation mechanism as well, just in general for all PowerShell resources or modules.
Thanks.
Okay, so the next question then is, once we have a resource module that we say is high quality, what do we name it? There's been a lot of complaints about the X naming convention. It supposedly stood for experimental, so then a high quality resource shouldn't have the experimental tag on it anymore. What should it be named? I know X SharePoint became SharePoint DSC. That's one option. Then we have things like, should XPS desired state configuration become PS desired state configuration DSC? I'm not sure. Oop. Can you hear me? Okay. What was the last thing I said? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
we can hear you.
Sorry, I have people telling me they can't hear me.
I can hear you.
Okay, good. So what do you guys think these modules should be named? Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, this is Dan Scott Rainsford. I like the SharePoint DSC style. So web administration DSC, even PS desired state configuration DSC. It seems to be the easiest one to go with.
Okay.
I think the pattern that was established in the RFC was to use the standards for command naming to name the modules. Command naming follows a specific guideline that PowerShell has been following for a long time, which is we're going to use Pascal casing to identify new word begins, and then do biggest concept leads followed by a next concept followed by next concept, to allow people to get to the point where they could say, okay, PS desired state configuration minus the X is a good example. It follows that context. That was put out in an RFC, but I don't know how many people actually saw it, and I don't know if anybody agrees with it. Is that a reasonable model?
Yeah, I think I'm going to agree with you there, Keith. And I know we had some back and forth for a little bit before we renamed the SharePoint DSC stuff to follow that model. But the logic behind that most important part first, I think, made a lot of sense, and sort of following that same model.
Okay. So in light of this update for the high quality resource modules, I think style matters, at least a little bit. Maybe not in the end product when you're putting it in production and just running the code. But for reviewing it, it tends to make a big difference. And so last week we actually updated our style guidelines. We didn't make a ton of changes. It's really just the same thing written with better examples. So if any of you guys are contributing to the resources, you should probably take a look at that, because we'd really like if you guys could try your best to follow the style guidelines for the resource kit. They're also in the main DSC resources repository. The only small change I would say that we made was with the placement of parameters in a function. But if we missed anything, please do let us know.
You have any examples for designing class-based resources in terms of
We don't have any
well-designed?
class-based resources in the resource kit right now. I haven't heard of any plans to add any. But if you're interested in that, I think we could open up the floor for it, and if you would like to submit a new resource that's class-based, I would be very interested in that.
Working on it, trying to get it to work.
Man, just throw it up there, Russ. We can help you out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll see if I can do that.
So like it needs to be actionable, right? So we need
From my standpoint, this is Ralph Kittle speaking. It seemed that there were some benefits of going to the class-based model moving forward. One of them being the ability to, I think it was to run some of the diagnostics against it. So I don't know if there's plans for, say, new resources that get created that they should follow the class model, or if there's any recommendations on that.
I know in terms of SharePoint DSC, this is something me and my team had a fairly lengthy discussion on when PowerShell 5 was still in preview. We made the very conscious decision to not go to class-based because we wanted to maintain support for PowerShell 4. Just given sort of the software that was required for SharePoint 2013, we didn't necessarily want to force everyone's hand to move to PowerShell 5. That said, though, there's a few little perks about the class-based model that we like. So we're conscious of the fact that it exists, and we may want to move to it in the future. But where we draw that line in the sand from, what versions of PowerShell we support, and essentially making sure that everyone's going to be able to get on board with PowerShell 5. That was something that we sort of didn't necessarily want to push everyone on at least when we first had that discussion.
So I know that's part of the reason why web administration hasn't been looking at hasn't been looking at class-based stuff, and actually tries to support back to 2008 for the stuff that we're working on. So I think it's kind of, well, I'd love to see more class stuff come up. I think we're going to have a problem that kind of like, we're going to have to, we kind of have to draw the line in the sand that says, what version of PowerShell do we want to support? Because they're, class-based, it doesn't work in 5. It only works in 5 and doesn't work in 4, So, like, if they think, like, as Brian's saying, like, SharePoint's decided, like, well, we want to support this older version, and, I think the resource will kind of have, like, it'll kind of be on a per-resource basis. Sorry, I got distracted by the chat. Per resource basis, because then it'll depend on, like, to what level we want to, the various authors want to support, so what operating system.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, no, it's good to hear some other points of view on that, because the initial, any custom authoring I've done actually use the commandlets that help style format, and once I saw the class come out, I said, oh, well, this must be the newest, best way to go, but I hadn't even really considered the backwards compatibility, so those are definitely great points.
Yeah, that's something we're dealing with in XPS desired state configuration now too. We have like set target resource will just contain an if statement for if it's on nano server or not, and then we will run a get target resource on nano server versus a get target resource on full server, and the nano server would be, I guess, the core way of doing it. The most basic way of doing it that we possibly could. However, a lot of the functions that the nano server is trying to call are not available in, let's say, WMF4, or even a lot in WMF 5.0. So backwards compatibility, I would say, is important in XPS DSC. So that's become an issue there too.
It's an interesting question in the chat that I'll call out in case anyone on the phone wants to chime in. I'm not going to try to butcher your name. I apologize. Asks, can class-based resources be fully tested using the available pester tests to pass validation? I actually personally don't have an answer to that, but I'm really curious to see what the call thinks.
What sort of pester tests? So I've fully testing a class-based resource. But
Yeah,
test DSC resource doesn't work on class-based resources. But there's also not as much of a need for that.
So are you talking about the test DSC resource function from the resource designer?
Yes.
Okay, so the resource designer was implemented purely for MOF-based
right.
Resources, but I have samples of how you can test class-based resources using pester. It's doable. But if you want to use the test DSC resource kind of thingy, it's not in there.
Yeah, no, it's just like I said, we test all of our resources, and unfortunately part of that is running the test DSC resource on everything, so I had to hack in a shim to not test any class-based resources because it just blew up our tests.
Okay, so is your ask then to have test DSC resource, either skip or do something smart for class-based resources, or?
No, I'm trying to flesh out what the meaning of the question about test to pass validation.
Just while you ask that question, then, Nana, I think it's probably worth making sure we do put something in the test DSC resource that can account for that, because I think the scenario you're edging on there is one that's going to come up sooner rather than later, just around its ability to validate class-based resources versus the schema-based ones at the moment. But I sort of saw the core of that question is, can we do unit testing with pester against the class-based resources? And while I haven't actually done it myself, everything I know about pester says it should be fine, because we're still just mocking things within the method calls and being able to run out with them from there.
Yeah, there are some gotchas about mocking doesn't work if you just load the class from the module. You have to evaluate it by executing a PS1 file or some other sort of way to invoke it. It seems at least a couple people I've talked to and myself have run into problems where pester will not mock methods that are inside the class if you're just loading it through the PSM1.
Okay.
Yes, that is a known limitation on pester, and we kind of work around that by having script functions and the directive mock. So yeah, you need certain workarounds in place to effectively use pester with classes.
So one of the other style guidelines for bringing up for creating the high quality resource kit is with the examples, because right now some of the examples that we have for the resources are not necessarily very easy to follow, or also a lot of them don't run right out of the box when you see them. So if people are just opening up a resource for the first time and want to know how to use it, sometimes the examples aren't as helpful. So we were just wondering if you guys had any feedback on what maybe some examples that are part of the resources you're contributing to, or if you have some good ideas for that, or if we should have specific guidelines for the examples.
I'm really curious to see kind of what the opinion is on pulling in other resources for the example. So I know in web administration, it's very easy for us to pull in, say, MySQL or something to, to kind of say set up a website and pointed at a database or something, kind of like I think there's a wiki module or something that kind of does this. Do we kind of want all of our resources to be self-contained, or are we kind of okay with like pulling across resources to make this stuff work?
So I think ideally what we would like is to have, similar to kind of how we have unit and integration tests, having examples both that run without outside resources or depending on any outside resources, and then also some that are much more like real world examples that would actually be used in production that could use like MySQL or whatever within the resource. But we haven't had any like set decisions on that or specific guidelines.
Yeah, so the examples is one thing that my team have been discussing on the SharePoint DSC stuff a little bit. So we're in planning for our next release to basically redo all of our example stuff. What we were thinking of aiming for, and I'll throw it out here just to get input on, was for each resource breaking. So at the moment we just have like a single SharePoint server and a small SharePoint farm as our examples. And the feedback we've been getting was that we're making a lot of assumptions about how people want to deploy SharePoint for those examples. So people were grabbing it and just sort of running it and saying, well, that wasn't necessarily the farm I wanted to get. So what we're looking at doing is per resource adding a couple of examples that say, for a scenario using that resource. So to deploy a web app with these settings, here's an example, and to deploy a web app with some other configuration, here's another example. So we're trying to figure out a way that we can sort of include some pseudo documentation, I suppose, with each example that says, if this example does this, and dump out the example below it and sort of structure that in some folders or something like to that extent. We're sort of going to flesh it out over the next week or two, but we wanted to make it resource by resource and have those scenarios for how they could be used as opposed to just a basic example, I suppose, was what we were thinking. Be keen to hear what anyone thinks about that kind of approach.
I think it's super valuable. I mean, that sounds really good to me. Also, you guys have a really cool way of like structuring your documentation and stuff. I know we talked about it in web administration and trying to pulling it over, and we didn't kind of go very far with it, but you kind of write all your documentation on the MOF files and itself, and then like create wiki documentation and all that stuff, so it's kind of easy to follow. Is that kind of like something you guys are still doing?
Yeah, we're still doing it. I want to rip so just for anyone on the call who's not familiar with what we've been doing in the SharePoint one, we add a bunch of comments to the top of the MOF files, the schema MOF files for each of our resources that have a description and basic example. And what we do at build time, so when it runs on our player, is we actually dynamically read the full MOF file, including the parameters and everything else in the schema, and use that to generate help files for PowerShell. So you can say get help about _ SP create farm or something to that extent. And it includes all the details of the parameters as well as those text-based comments and things like that. And we also use those to generate wiki pages for GitHub so that you can have that exact same documentation for that release both in the module and on the wiki. We are still doing that. I do want to get away from, so putting it in the MOF file was kind of quick and dirty for us as far as getting the documentation in there. I want to take it out and put it into like just a markdown file that sits inside of each resource folder. So it's a little bit more obvious that it's documentation versus the comments in the schema file there. But that same approach of continuing to generate that kind of documentation and those examples there is something that we're going to continue doing. At least for SharePoint DSC, because that was sort of where we started with that, just as a way to help with our own documentation and examples.
Well, I think it's a kind of a shining example of what our documentation should look like, in my opinion. I kind of hope I can get web administration looking something like that soon. So.
I'll jump in here. I'll echo. I think really appreciated the documentation for the SharePoint DSC resources. As someone who's again not using traditional DSC, I think it's really great that we've got some non-opinionated like mechanisms to show me like this is how I could lift and land it into other and use it with other technologies. So having examples baked out like that would be awesome from my perspective.
It's just as a thought, Naomi, as you kind of said you use Chef. could, as a person who has never used Chef but is kind of interested in it, would it be possible for you to maybe give some examples, since we could have some opinionated versions of saying, hey, if you're using Chef, here's a way to use it, when leverage DSC to do this stuff, and actually have documentation of how to do that?
Yeah, probably. I'm actually going to be at ChefConf on July 12th talking about this, so hopefully we'll have some more information out there, but I'll see what I can do in the meantime.
Okay, on to the next topic, which is talking about what do you guys think are some best practices for DSC resources? We would like to compile, kind of like the style guidelines, a document of best practices that contributors can follow, so they don't make a lot of common mistakes, say, when writing resources. Any thoughts? We actually dug 2 of them out of our style guidelines. Things that aren't really style is not to use commandlet aliases was one. Another one was always using, say, named parameters rather than positional parameters, so that a developer that's coming in after you doesn't have to go look up the command for what parameter is the default, say. Some PowerShell best practices, not using write host, using SimNow instead of WMI, using PS credentials instead of usernames and passwords. Was there anything that you guys would specifically really like to see in that best practices document?
Kind of feel like as you've asked the question, we're all now completely spacing on stuff, and we may have had things to put in there.
Use write verbose, write debug liberally.
Can we actually use write debug in a DSC resource? Like, does that actually work? I ask because I work purely in PowerShell, like in WMI4. So, I mean, do we get something in PowerShell 5 where it actually will break or something when you use write debug?
I have it in a resource, and I don't remember how I used it. So.
Because otherwise, I completely agree with you. I'm just like wondering if but I've typically not used it because it didn't actually, work the way I kind of assumed it did.
No, I think it's just an extra stream.
Yeah, it'll probably just write to the debug output, whatever that's set to. Okay. Well, I know we have a couple module maintainers on here. Those are people who, say, have write access to a repository, so they can merge pull requests, close issues, assign issues, label everything. I think Tyson, you're one for XWebAdmin.
And networking and MySQL.
Yeah.
And I think the computer management, I think, are the 4 or 5 that I have.
Yeah. Brian is our maintainer for SharePoint. And so for those maintainers, is there anything that you guys would like to see from us? From the team that works on the DSC Resource Kit overall?
I think, as I jokingly call him, my Kiwi has a good question. Daniel Scott Ransford asks, I do have a question I wanted to raise at the end. However, if someone could possibly raise it, what is the status for reviewing the new DSC resource module submitted to the DSC repo? So I guess he does kind of bring up a point, maybe not to my stuff in particular, but how are we kind of handling bringing in new stuff? And maybe kind of how can we do that better? I'm not something I've done too often, so I don't have much feedback right there, but.
Yeah. So I happen to know that yes, Daniel submitted a resource, I think, yesterday, and we have a couple other ones that we're looking at. And well, we've just gone through kind of a transition because, as you guys can know, Charles was the previous owner of the DSC Resource Kit, and I came onto the Resource Kit in April. So I've started looking at those, but I think we're going to have some other people review them just to make sure that they are up to snuff to come into the DSC Resource Kit. But I'm definitely looking at them, like now. So we are reviewing them if they're there. Is there any new resources that you guys really want?
This is Ralph Kittle again. I've spoken with some of the people on the call from the product side already on this, but seeing resources get developed that can help us with configuring user rights assignment, audit settings, and security settings from the OS perspective. The customer that I work with has got a lot of security guidelines and hardening settings that they look to implement, and a lot of those are pushed out via group policy right now, but we don't have any methods really for pushing those out via DSC. I think there might have been a couple modules that Zachary Alexander shared with us that are currently experimental or driven by the community, but seeing these resources as kind of approved and signed by Microsoft in some way would go a long way to getting some more adoption of DSC at my customer.
So there is a X system security. Is that kind of like in the scope of it, of kind of like what you're kind of thinking? I think this is kind of around UAC and
not around UAC as much. It's more the various type of settings in group policy, like user rights assignments. So defining which accounts can log on as a service or log on locally to machines. There's various security settings within that option as well, and audit settings. So there are some experimental resources that are out there, but they're not, it'd be great to see kind of more ownership from just Microsoft on those resources, depending on, the customer bases that we're working with. Some customers, want more assurance that the resources have been reviewed by Microsoft, then they're just part of some community resource that's available. Now, the community resources are obviously great, but having the idea that the Microsoft team has kind of signed off on their validity, and they're not going to cause any unknown or any issues that might be in the environment.
Oh, one of the other things. Sorry, this is Mariah again from the DSC or PowerShell team. And once we finalize our plan for getting rid of the experimental part of the resource, we're going to have like a procedure to review also the new resources coming in and making sure they meet all of our style qualities and everything like that as well. So again, that's still kind of in process right now of developing that. But that'll, I think, help a lot to just have a more defined set of like goals or set of just like guidelines and process for adding new resources.
Yep. Hi, Ralph. This is Zach. Hi, Adam.
Hey, Zach.
This is also Zach. We're all working on the security and the security and audit one specifically. Yep. I don't have any dates for you yet, but they're very important to me as well.
Very good.
And actually, I just want to ask a refinement of, I think it was Katie's question. Are there any resources around specifically managing client settings that people are interested in? We just talked about security, which can apply to both client and server, but are there any client-specific ones that people are interested in?
I think kind of for us, one of the things we're looking at how to manage like images better, and kind of like you're saying clients, I'm thinking like Windows, like desktop OS stuff. I don't know if that's what you're kind of referring to. Something that basically pops up and tells the user, hey, I need to reboot your system, or I'm going to be doing stuff for whatever, kind of like, which I don't think are really resource dependent, but more of just how DSC works. Because like one of the things that we are not looking at DSC for the client OSs is because if I need to go do something with like an open program or I need to reboot the system, I don't have a good way of kind of like letting the user know in any kind of like poll setting or where it'll constantly go and fix itself. And I don't want to just, torch whatever the user's working on. So we're kind of looking away from DSC because there's no good story around that. So if that's something we're kind of looking at, that'd be amazing to us, and I'd be willing to go pilot that for you. And I do work at Microsoft, by the way. So like, we could definitely give that a go for kind of like get something where it just says, hey, we're gonna reboot, or hey, when you're done, I'm gonna go make changes to your system. Just make sure to close out all your stuff. I'm gonna, whatever. I don't have a good idea what that looks like right now, but just I know that's like one of the things, like one of the reasons we're not looking at DSC to manage those problems.
Great.
Sweet. Do you guys think there's anything we can do to help people contribute to the resource kit?
Label first-timer bugs better. I'm awful at that.
First time.
The one. Sorry. What did you say there, Tyson? Sorry.
I said label the first-timer bugs, so kind of things that like a person who's not. Sorry if I mumbled that. Like kind of, there's a number of concepts out there I've seen where people use that, where it's like, hey, I'm a first-time contributor, first-time open source contributor, or something. Kind of like a easy, hey, you can jump in here, or something kind of like low-hanging fruit to kind of get your feet in, like get your feet in to looking at stuff. I think setting out better to kind of. I know something like one guy jumped in and said, hey, I want to update your documentation. But I don't feel like we've really got good guidelines around that now that I'm now realizing this, because you asked earlier what can we improve, and of course I said I'm completely blanked on it. It's having better like, hey, we're looking for these types of documentations and kind of laying that out really clearly. This could be one way people could jump in. Encouraging more community discussions around new resources as they're coming in. Like I know like not a lot of people like are looking at like say the stuff Daniel was bringing in, because those tend to be super large, but those are also the ones like we need to get a ton of eyes on, and then maybe gets it off Katie's plate a little better, because dear God, I would not want to be looking through all that.
The one request we get from a lot of our new contributors in SharePoint DSC is for better guidance and information around writing the unit tests. That seems to be the thing that trips most of our new contributors up, but they understand how to write the DSC resources themselves. It's not super difficult to get around, but the PESTA test seems to cause the steepest learning curve for new contributors from what I've seen.
Is there any like pro sites or anything kind of videos to kind of talk about how or best? Do we have best practices, or not just in PowerShell, but does Pester have best practices on how to write their unit tests?
I mean, they've got a few, and some of that I've gotten out of conversation with the guys who wrote it just from my interactions with them. But I don't know that they're super well documented.
I think maybe like that would be interesting to kind of see from that point, and for us to kind of set up our best practices around that. I know you've been driving a conversation around that, kind of like what that would look like. And I think kind of I think you're right there. I think setting up that would be really awesome to see, because I know like the way I've written all of ours and kind of is Daniel and I kind of just agreed on it at one point, and we just started like shoveling forward on the resources we owned, like because we just kind of like, well, we need to coverage it, call over the functions, so just top it all at the top, just call describe this thing, and then just go. But like it's just because what made sense to us. But yeah, I think you're right. I think better documentation around that would be fantastic.
Yeah, we could definitely add a lot better test guidelines, and maybe a tutorial of like how to write your first test.
That'd be good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so again, I'm not going to butcher names, but just for anyone who doesn't have IM, as an IT admin with some programming experience, but I've never done unit testing, it's very hard to find a good tutorial for using Pester. I think we have hit something we definitely need to cover.
I've got some basic material. We've been So one of the things in Microsoft Premiere is we do like workshops and training and that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I recently wrote a module that we're working into one of our PowerShell workshops around what Pester is, how to do Pester, and some basic labs and that sort of stuff to go with it. I might kick some tires around and see how much of that is reusable if I wanted to put that out a little bit more publicly, just in terms of that specific module, because that might be a good just general ramp up on Pester. It's not a DSC specific intro to Pester, but we could probably take some bits and pieces out of it and sort of look at publishing something to that extent.
So as a thought, and I will have to say this, I've actually got a meeting that I'm now going to be late for because I'm super interested in this conversation. I do have to run. Could we get, there's something I ran into before when I was learning C# was like Kanbans of kind of like a program that would walk you through writing this stuff because it would fail, like where you didn't have a certain type or something and the program would continue doing. Is there something we can maybe do with Pester where it's like, okay, you're going to write all these unit tests and we're going to walk you through how to do this. You know, you fork this and then you start writing this stuff to kind of get a sense of like how mocks work and how all this stuff works, kind of framing it in that kind of as an all up, how to use Pester, and then we can also kind of in the process kind of fork in some DSC stuff to say, oh hey, here's how you write stuff for here's how you write stuff for a module, here's how you write stuff for a script, here's how you write stuff for DSC resources, and kind of design it that way to kind of like walk them through interactively.
Yeah, something like that would be awesome if we had the time to pull it together, I think. But I do like the idea of where that's going.
Yeah, I'll write it down and hopefully get something kind of a little more fleshed out and open up an issue somewhere or something.
We could write, like a contributor story or something like, oh, you found this issue, this is the first step you take, and then you edit the resource, and then you edit the tests, and this is how you can fix the tests, and then this is how you need to update the README, and then this is how you can submit a pull request, and yeah.
So yeah, I really think maybe some better stories around that would be perfect, because I know it took me a long time to kind of wrap my head around it, and especially as people have said, like as an IT admin, like doesn't write code all day,
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm going to read this one last comment from someone, and then I got a jet, but who writes, Johan writes, question around reviewing some resources of the PRs that are stalled in the review process, thinking that people might be waiting for PowerShell team to review, but we need more community reviewers, so PowerShell team can just merge after all the checks are complete, question mark. So I know I've been very busy with a lot of things, and even though I'm not actually on the PowerShell team, I actually work in games and just happen to leverage this stuff. I know if you tag me on anything, I'm going to try to get to it. I know a lot of people on my resources will try to help out as best we can. I think better documentation around how to contribute and these Pester stuff we're kind of talking about, I think we'll kind of just have to try to get people engaged and working with us. I don't really know how to make that better.
Yeah, around the area of these reviewing pull requests, I think we should probably put up some kind of instructions or guidelines or tutorial too about how you can actually review somebody else's pull request.
Oh, that'd be perfect. All right, I'm late, so I got to run. Thank you all so much. This has been great. I look forward to the next one.
Thanks, Tyson.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Yeah, to your point there, Katie, I think maybe, again, just a quick intro to reviewable, just sort of saying, hey, here's what the process of reviewing a pull request looks like would be again, useful. Because, again, that was something that, I won't say tripped up our guys, but when the reviewable stuff just started appearing in our repo, we're like, oh, what's that? And had a bit of a click through. But sort of a quick intro to what it is and how to use it to review a pull request would also be pretty useful.
Mm-hmm. And then also probably something about AppVeyor and what to do if the tests fail. What to do if
so like looking at the tests and the checks and how they all surface up in reviewable and determining where something has failed to be able to put a comment on it and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, so lots of tutorials. Add all the tutorials. Anything else that you guys would really think help contributors? Are there any overall improvements to the DSC Resource Kit that you guys would like to see happen? Anything that the team over here can do to make your lives easier, whether you're using the resources or maintaining them or contributing to them or reviewing them, or
Ryan just put an interesting one in the IAM window, some auto fixes for some of the style guidelines. So if we've got something that could be cleaned up with a script, that would be interesting.
Yeah, that's actually something that me and Katie have talked about implementing in the near future. So yeah, that would definitely be helpful.
Yeah, I'd love to see that. I've got 69 resources that I need to convert back across to it, so some auto fixes would be awesome.
yeah, part of the whole updating for high quality resource modules, the reason we want to make plans for those and have concrete steps is so that we can actually write scripts for them to test if something is a high quality resource module, but also maybe to automate style or some of the easier parts of making a resource higher quality.
Yeah, I'd definitely be on board with that kind of approach.
Yeah, another one we were thinking of is automating, I guess, more documentation rather than having to maybe update the README every time yourself, having some kind of automatic way to do that. Do you guys have any questions for us? There's a question in the IM about aren't the functions for style fixes to fix the style already available? And there are some, but
yeah, so the ones that are there will fix things like file encoding and tabs for four spaces, but some of the other style ones like braces on new lines and parameter layouts and that sort of stuff, they're not included in those.
Yeah, so the style guidelines are actually pretty extensive, and we'd like a way for you to just automatically run a script on your code and have it be styled exactly the right way. For the comment in IM, Stin's comment about is there already a decision on what the approach is on dropping the X? We talked about this a little before, about what the naming convention should be. I think the consensus on here was that everybody likes the like SharePoint DSC, having web admin DSC and everything like that. That seemed to be the consensus I heard on this call. And then instead of having the X, if something is still in preview or experimental, it'll just have a version that's before 1.0. So it'll be like version 0.1 or 0.2 if it's still in preview. So we wouldn't need that experimental label at all anymore.
So to clarify, Katie, I think the RFC actually says that modules that are being published, they have to follow the or no, this isn't in the RFC. I take that back. This is in the discussion issues around the RFC and not in the RFC itself. But the place that seems to have reached consensus is if your module contains only DSC stuff and is ever going to only contain DSC resources, then by all means name it, major topic, next major topic, DSC, and that's fine. If it, in the cases where we have an inbox module where there are conflicts, we're certainly going to have to take that approach, like SharePoint that Brian released and guys did a great job with. The differentiator is if you think that you have a module that is going to contain things other than DSC, then including DSC suffix is not necessarily appropriate. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Makes perfect sense. I think
I'll write that up and extend it as another RFC just so we can make sure everybody that there really is consensus on that, because it was really only covered in discussion. It wasn't formal.
Mm-hmm. All right. Is there any other topics anybody would like to discuss? All right. Well, do you guys think it's useful to have a like a regular community call? Oh, and look, that's the question. I am. Do you guys think it's useful to have calls like this? Like regular scheduled calls so that we can all talk? I'm seeing a lot of yeses on I am. Okay.
Does once a month seem like a reasonable time period between calls? Is there any objection to that or any different kind of time frame?
Yeah, I think monthly would be a pretty decent start.
Okay.
Would you guys prefer having a call after a release or before a release? Or it just doesn't matter, as long as we have the call? Matthew says after, or one before and one after could be good. I could do it before so that you know what's coming in the release, or we could do it after so that we can start planning for the next release. Any thoughts? So for all you guys in a different time zone, there seem to be quite a few people in, say, I think Brian's in Australia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this one started at 6 a.m. for me, which was a little early, but given that we're trying to get a global call, there's always someone that's going to miss out time zone-wise.
Well, would maybe later in the afternoon work? Later in the afternoon our time, so maybe like 2 or 3 hours after this phone call started.
Yeah, later in the afternoon for you guys would work out brilliantly for me personally on a very selfish note, but yes, that would be great.
Well, I know we have quite a few like major
Yeah.
contributors from like Australia, New Zealand, so I think that's definitely reasonable. Do we have any other people from regions other than North America or Australia time zones, maybe like Europe or anything? EU, okay, yeah.
Yeah, see, there's the other end. If we go
Yeah.
later, it's the middle of the night in Europe.
Yeah, to the point that a couple of people have made in there as well. I think publishing an actual calendar invite just so that people don't trip up on the time conversion might be a useful thing as well.
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so for anybody who joined the call late, are there any topics that you'd like us to review? Yes, I can make the recording of the whole thing available so that you guys can hear the whole discussion of what was talked about. Oh, and I know I mentioned my Twitter earlier and how I've started putting updates on there about when I release the resource kit, so you guys have a warning. My Twitter handle is KatieDSC. It does not match my GitHub handle. Okay. Well, unless anybody has any other questions, that's all I've got. So thank you guys for coming and listening to us talking about the DSC Resource Kit and sharing your feedback, and it really helps us a lot with knowing what's useful for you guys that we should do. So thank you.
Thanks for organizing, Katie.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone.